The warm summer evening filled the backyard with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Margaret stood by the kitchen window, watching her family celebrate what she thought was the most beautiful milestone any couple could reach: 50 years of marriage. The golden anniversary party was everything she had dreamed of, with white lights strung between the old oak trees and tables covered in her grandmother's lace tablecloths. At 72, Margaret still moved with the grace of someone who had spent decades caring for others. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she wore the blue dress that Robert always said brought out her eyes. She smiled as she watched her husband of 50 years sitting at the head table, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Even at 75, Robert carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had first caught her attention all those years ago. Their love story had begun in the most ordinary way possible. It was 1973, and Margaret was a young nurse working the evening shift at City General Hospital. She was 22, full of energy and dreams, dedicating her life to helping others heal. Her friends often teased her about being too serious, always studying or working extra shifts instead of dating. But Margaret believed that when the right person came along, she would know. That person turned out to be Robert. She met him at a community dance organized by the local church. Margaret had only gone because her friend practically dragged her there, insisting she needed to have some fun. She remembered standing by the refreshment table, feeling awkward in her best dress when a gentle voice asked if she would like to dance. Robert was different from the other men she had met. While others were loud and trying to impress everyone, he was quiet and thoughtful. He listened when she talked about her work at the hospital, asking genuine questions about her patients and her dreams of maybe becoming a head nurse someday. When he spoke about his job as an accountant, his eyes lit up not because he loved numbers, but because he loved helping small business owners understand their finances and build better futures. What struck Margaret most was his kindness. During their first dance, an elderly woman sitting alone caught his attention. Without saying a word, Robert walked over and invited her to dance, spending 10 minutes making her smile and laugh. When he returned to Margaret, he simply said, "Everyone deserves to feel special at a party." That moment, Margaret knew she had found someone extraordinary. Their courtship was sweet and old-fashioned. Robert would pick her up after her hospital shifts, often bringing small gifts, a single flower, her favorite coffee, or a book he thought she might enjoy. He never pushed for more than she was comfortable giving, and he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions about everything, from current events to her dreams for the future. What made their relationship special was how perfectly they balanced each other. Margaret was naturally outgoing and social, the type of person who could make friends with anyone in 5 minutes. Robert was more reserved, preferring quiet conversations and small gatherings. But together, they created something beautiful. Margaret brought Robert out of his shell, encouraging him to share his thoughts and dreams. Robert gave Margaret a sense of calm and stability she had never experienced before. 6 months after they met, Robert proposed in the hospital parking lot after Margaret finished a particularly difficult shift. She had lost a patient that day, an elderly man who reminded her of her own grandfather. Robert was waiting by her car with hot chocolate and tissues, knowing without being told that she would need both. As she cried against his shoulder, he whispered, "I want to spend my life taking care of you the way you take care of everyone else." The proposal was simple and perfect, just like Robert himself. They married in a small ceremony 6 months later. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, and Robert looked handsome in a suit he had saved up for months to buy. The wedding was small but filled with love, with Margaret's large Italian family welcoming Robert with open arms. What touched Margaret most was seeing how easily Robert fit into her family, helping her father with projects around the house and listening patiently to her mother's endless stories about the old country. The one thing that sometimes puzzled Margaret was Robert's lack of family. He had told her that his parents and only sister had died in a car accident when he was 19, leaving him completely alone in the world. The pain in his eyes when he spoke about it was so real that Margaret never questioned the details. She simply made sure he felt extra love during holidays and family gatherings, knowing that her family would become his family. Their early years of marriage were challenging but happy. They lived in a tiny apartment above a bakery, with Robert, working long hours at an accounting firm while Margaret continued her nursing career. Money was tight, but they were rich in love and dreams. They spent evenings planning their future, talking about the house they would buy, the children they hoped to have, and the life they would build together. Robert was incredibly responsible, with money, keeping careful track of every penny they spent. Margaret sometimes joked that he could account for every dollar that had ever passed through their hands. She appreciated his careful nature, especially since her own family had always struggled with money. Robert's planning and saving meant they could afford small luxuries like dinner out once a month or a weekend trip to the lake. Their first child arrived 3 years after their wedding, a daughter they named Linda. Margaret watched Robert transform into a devoted father, staying up all night when the baby was sick and reading parenting books like they were instruction manuals. Their son David followed 2 years later, completing their perfect little family. As the years passed, Robert proved to be everything Margaret had hoped for in a husband and father. He coached Little League baseball, helped with homework every night, and never missed a school play or graduation. He worked extra hours when the family needed something special, like Linda's wedding dress or David's college tuition, but he never complained about the sacrifice. The only unusual thing about Robert was his occasional trips out of town for work. He would disappear for a weekend every few months, explaining that he had to visit clients in other cities. Margaret never questioned these trips because Robert had always been honest about everything else, and the extra money he earned helped pay for family vacations and home improvements. Now, 50 years later, Margaret looked around at the party and felt overwhelming gratitude. Their children had grown into wonderful adults with families of their own. Linda was a teacher, married to a kind man who treated her like a queen. David had followed his father's footsteps into business, building a successful company while raising 3 beautiful children. Robert's speech that evening brought tears to everyone's eyes. He stood slowly, his hand shaking slightly as he raised his glass. 50 years ago, I was a man with nothing, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret gave me everything: love, family, purpose, and a reason to be better than I ever thought I could be. Every day with her has been a gift I never deserved. As the party wound down and the last guests said their goodbyes, Margaret and Robert sat together on their porch swing, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Margaret rested her head on Robert's shoulder, feeling the same sense of peace and contentment she had felt for 50 years. "We did good, didn't we?" she whispered. Robert's arm tightened around her, and she felt him nod. "Better than I ever dreamed possible," he replied. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their beautiful life together, Margaret had no idea that the foundation of everything she believed was about to crumble. The man she had loved and trusted for 50 years was carrying secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about their life together. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 months after their golden anniversary celebration. Margaret noticed Robert standing in the kitchen one morning, staring at the coffee maker like he had never seen it before. When she gently asked if he needed help, he looked at her with confusion and said, "I can't remember how to make coffee." This was the same man who had made her coffee every morning for 50 years, always adding just the right amount of cream and sugar. Margaret's nursing background immediately made her alert to the possibility of memory problems, but she tried to stay calm. Maybe Robert was just tired or stressed. At 75, it was normal for people to have occasional forgetful moments. She helped him with the coffee that morning and made a mental note to keep a closer eye on him. Over the next few weeks, these small incidents became more frequent. Robert would forget where he put his reading glasses, even though they were hanging around his neck. He got lost driving to the grocery store he had visited for 20 years. Most concerning was when he forgot their grandson's name during a family dinner, calling him by their son David's name instead. Margaret suggested they visit their family doctor, Dr. Peterson, who had been taking care of them for 15 years. After running several tests and asking Robert dozens of questions about his memory, Dr. Peterson delivered the news Margaret had been dreading. Robert was showing early signs of dementia, likely Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had cared for many patients with dementia during her nursing career, and she knew what lay ahead. But knowing something professionally was completely different from facing it with the person you loved most in the world. Dr. Peterson explained that Robert's condition would gradually worsen, affecting his memory, thinking, and eventually his ability to care for himself. Margaret threw herself into research, reading everything she could find about dementia care. She bought special calendars, pill organizers, and safety equipment for their home. She labeled cabinets and drawers with pictures and words to help Robert remember where things belonged. Most importantly, she made sure Robert felt loved and supported rather than frustrated or embarrassed by his changing abilities. The early stages were manageable. Robert could still have conversations and enjoy activities he had always loved, like working in their garden and watching old movies together. Margaret learned to go along with his confusion rather than constantly correcting him. If he forgot they had eaten lunch, she would simply offer him a snack. If he asked about visiting his parents who had been gone for decades, she would redirect the conversation to happier memories. But as months passed, Robert began exhibiting behaviors that truly worried Margaret. He became obsessed with finding important documents that he claimed were hidden somewhere in the house. Every day, she would find him searching through closets, drawers, and storage boxes, becoming increasingly agitated when he couldn't find what he was looking for. "Where are the papers?" he would ask her repeatedly, his eyes filled with panic. "I need to find the important papers before it's too late." Margaret would gently ask what papers he meant, but Robert could never explain clearly. Sometimes he would mention birth certificates or family documents. Other times he would talk about proof or evidence without specifying what kind. She assumed this was typical confusion related to his condition, perhaps memories of organizing their tax, documents, or insurance papers getting mixed up in his mind. The searching became more intense and desperate. Margaret would wake up in the middle of the night to find Robert going through their bedroom closet with a flashlight, pulling out boxes of old Christmas decorations and photo albums. He would examine each item carefully, as if looking for some hidden clue, before moving on to the next box with growing frustration. During his more lucid moments, Robert seemed deeply troubled by something he couldn't quite remember or express. He would sit quietly for hours, staring out the window with the expression of profound sadness. When Margaret asked what was bothering him, he would shake his head and say, "There's something I should have told you, but I can't remember what it was." These conversations broke Margaret's heart. She could see that Robert was struggling with some internal conflict, but she attributed it to the natural confusion and anxiety that often accompanied dementia. She would hold his hand and reassure him that whatever he was worried about, they could face it together just like they had faced everything else in their 50 years of marriage. Robert began leaving notes around the house, written in his increasingly shaky handwriting. Margaret would find them tucked into books taped to mirrors or slipped under her pillow. The notes contained phrases like, "Please forgive me," "I should have been honest," and "The truth is in the blue box." Some notes were longer, but the handwriting was so unclear that Margaret couldn't make out all the words. Margaret collected these notes in a shoebox, thinking that maybe Dr. Peterson would want to see them as examples of Robert's declining cognitive function. She mentioned the notes during their monthly medical appointments, and Dr. Peterson explained that many dementia patients experienced guilt and anxiety about imagined wrongdoings. It was common for patients to believe they had done something terrible or forgotten something crucial, even when there was no basis in reality. The note writing became more frequent and urgent. Robert would wake up in the middle of the night and spend hours writing, his hand moving slowly across the paper as he struggled to form letters. Margaret would find him at the kitchen table in the morning, surrounded by crumpled papers and looking exhausted. When she asked what he was writing, he would look at her with desperate eyes and say, "I'm trying to remember what I need to tell you." One particularly difficult evening, Robert became extremely agitated about something he called the blue box. He insisted that there was a blue metal box hidden somewhere in the house that contained important information Margaret needed to know. He searched frantically through every room, pulling out furniture and emptying drawers, all while muttering about how crucial it was to find this box. Margaret tried to calm him down, explaining that she didn't remember any blue box and suggesting that maybe it was something from his childhood or a memory that had gotten confused. But Robert became so upset that she worried he might hurt himself. She finally called their son David, who came over to help calm his father down and assist with the cleanup. That night, as Margaret lay awake listening to Robert's restless sleep, beside her she felt more alone than she had ever felt in their 50 years together. The man she had shared everything with was slowly disappearing, trapped inside a mind that was betraying him. She wondered what thoughts and memories were tangled up in his confused brain, and she wished she could reach inside and fix whatever was causing him such distress. What Margaret didn't know was that Robert's desperate searching and cryptic notes weren't products of dementia-induced confusion. In his few remaining moments of clarity, he was trying to find the courage and the words to confess a secret he had carried for 50 years. The blue box he kept mentioning wasn't a figment of his imagination, but a real hiding place containing documents that would shatter everything Margaret believed about their life together. As Robert's condition continued to worsen, his window of opportunity to make this confession was rapidly closing. Soon Margaret would discover the truth on her own, in a way that would be far more devastating than any conversation could have been. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in March. Margaret had developed a routine over the past year of caring for Robert, and routines helped both of them feel more secure. She would wake up first, make coffee, and organize Robert's medications in the little plastic containers marked with days of the week. This particular morning, Robert seemed more confused than usual, asking her 3 times who she was before finally recognizing her as his wife. After breakfast, Robert began his usual restless wandering around the house, looking for the mysterious documents that had consumed his thoughts for months. Margaret watched him sadly, wishing she could ease whatever anxiety was driving this constant searching. She had learned not to argue with him about the papers anymore, instead just making sure he stayed safe while he looked. Around 10 in the morning, Margaret realized they were running low on Robert's heart medication. Dr. Peterson had increased the dosage the previous week, and they had gone through the bottle faster than expected. She knew how important it was for Robert to take his medication on schedule, especially since his dementia made it harder for his body to handle any disruptions to his routine. Margaret decided to search through their bedroom for any backup medications they might have stored away. Over 50 years of marriage, they had accumulated quite a collection of old prescription bottles, bandages, and medical supplies in various drawers and closets. She often found forgotten medications tucked away in places she had completely forgotten about. She started with the obvious places: the medicine cabinet in their bathroom, the drawer in Robert's nightstand, and the small box on her dresser where she kept vitamins and supplements. When those searches came up empty, she moved to the bedroom closet, which had become a repository for everything from old coats to seasonal decorations over the years. The closet was deep and narrow, stretching back under the eaves of their house. Margaret had to move several boxes of Christmas ornaments and winter clothes to reach the back corners where older items were stored. She was looking specifically for a small plastic container where she remembered storing various medical supplies. But as she moved the Christmas decorations, something caught her attention. Behind the boxes of holiday lights and artificial garland, there was a slight gap in the back wall of the closet. At first, Margaret thought it might be a natural separation in the wood paneling, but when she looked closer, she could see that one of the panels was actually loose. Her nursing background had taught her to be observant about details, and something about this gap seemed intentional rather than accidental. Margaret carefully moved more boxes out of the way to get a better look. When she pressed gently on the loose panel, it shifted slightly, revealing that it wasn't actually attached to the wall behind it. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized this might be some kind of hidden compartment. Maybe Robert had been right about important documents being hidden in the house, though she couldn't imagine why he would have concealed anything from her. Using a small flashlight she kept in the closet for power outages, Margaret carefully worked the panel free from its position. Behind it was a small space, just big enough to hold a few items. And there, exactly as Robert had described in his confused ramblings, was a blue metal box about the size of a shoebox. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than she expected, and she could hear papers rustling inside when she moved it. The metal was old and slightly rusty around the edges, suggesting it had been hidden for many years. There was no lock, just a simple latch that opened, with a small click that seemed to echo through the quiet bedroom. Inside the box, Margaret found documents that made no sense to her at first glance. On top was a birth certificate, but the name on it read Roberto Martinez, not Robert Chen. The birth date was correct. She knew Robert's birthday by heart after 50 years, but everything else was different. The place of birth was listed as Guadalajara, Mexico, not Chicago, Illinois, as Robert had always told her. Beneath the birth certificate were immigration papers, also bearing the name Roberto Martinez. Margaret studied them carefully, her nursing training helping her focus on details even as her mind reeled with confusion. The papers were dated 1972, just 1 year before she had met Robert. They appeared to be documentation of someone entering the United States, but they were stamped with words she didn't understand and had an official appearance that suggested they were legitimate government documents. But it was the photographs that truly shattered Margaret's world. Underneath the official papers were several family photos, the kind of pictures that families take at special occasions and keep as treasured memories. The photos showed Robert, unmistakably Robert, looking exactly as he had when she first met him, but he was with people Margaret had never seen before. In the largest photograph, Robert stood with his arm around a beautiful woman with dark hair and kind eyes. She was wearing a white dress and Robert was in a suit, and they were clearly at some kind of celebration. 2 young children, a boy and a girl who appeared to be perhaps 6 and 8 years old, stood in front of the couple, all of them smiling at the camera. Margaret turned the photograph over with shaking hands. Written on the back in Robert's familiar handwriting were the words, Mi querida familia, my dear family. The date written below was 1971, 2 years before Margaret had met Robert and 3 years before their own wedding. More photographs showed the same family in various settings, at what appeared to be birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and everyday moments. In every picture, Robert looked happy and natural, clearly comfortable with these people who were complete strangers to Margaret. The children called him Papa in one photo where someone had written captions, and the woman was always close to his side, their body language showing the intimacy of a married couple. As Margaret continued searching through the box, she found letters written in Spanish. She couldn't read Spanish, but she recognized Robert's handwriting on the envelopes. Some of the letters appeared to be quite recent, with postmarks from just a few years ago. There were also what appeared to be money transfer receipts, showing regular payments sent to someone named Elena Martinez in Guadalajara, Mexico. The amounts on the receipts made Margaret's head spin. Over the years, Robert had been sending hundreds of dollars every month to this Elena Martinez. Margaret quickly calculated in her head. Over the course of their marriage, these payments would have totaled tens of thousands of dollars. Money that Robert had somehow managed to send without her knowledge, despite the fact that she thought she was aware of all their financial transactions. Margaret sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by the contents of the blue box, feeling as if the foundation of her entire life was crumbling beneath her. For 50 years she had believed she knew everything about the man she loved. She had comforted him about his tragic loss of family, never suspecting that he actually had a family. He was hiding from her. She had trusted him completely with their finances, never imagining he was secretly supporting another household. The most devastating realization was that if these documents were real, then everything Robert had told her about his past was a lie. He wasn't an orphaned accountant from Chicago who had lost his family in a tragic accident. He was Roberto Martinez from Mexico, a man who had apparently left behind a wife and children to start a new life in America under a false identity. Margaret heard Robert moving around in the living room, probably continuing his endless search for the very box she now held in her hands. She wondered how long he had been trying to find the courage to tell her the truth, and whether his dementia had been both a curse and a blessing, making it impossible for him to confess, but also making it impossible for him to continue carrying the weight of such an enormous secret. As she carefully placed the documents back in the blue box, Margaret realized that her life as she knew it was over. Everything she had believed about their marriage, their love, and their shared history was now in question. She was about to confront the man she had loved for 50 years with evidence that he had been living a double life since the day they met. Margaret sat on their bedroom floor for what felt like hours. The blue box opened beside her like Pandora's box that had released 50 years of secrets. Her mind raced through decades of memories, examining them with new eyes. Every business trip Robert had taken, every careful accounting of their finances, every time he had seemed distant or preoccupied. Suddenly, everything took on a different meaning. She could hear Robert in the living room, moving furniture around as he continued his frantic search for the very box she now held. The irony wasn't lost on her that he had been desperately trying to find the courage to confess, while she had unknowingly stumbled upon the truth he had been hiding. Margaret knew she had to confront him, but she also knew that timing was crucial. Robert's dementia meant that his lucid moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Margaret carefully placed all the documents back in the blue box and carried it to the living room. Robert was standing by the bookshelf, pulling out photo albums and looking behind them with growing frustration. When he saw her holding the metal box, his entire body seemed to freeze. For a moment, his eyes cleared completely, and she saw recognition and terror flash across his face. "You found it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The confusion that had clouded his features for months suddenly lifted, and Margaret found herself looking at the Robert she remembered from years past, alert, aware, and completely present. "Yes, I found it," Margaret replied, setting the box on their coffee table between them. "Robert, we need to talk about what's inside." Robert sank into his favorite armchair, the one where he had read bedtime stories to their children and later to their grandchildren. His hands shook as he stared at the box, and Margaret could see tears forming in his eyes. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the anniversary clock their children had given them, marking off the seconds of this moment that would change everything. "I wanted to tell you so many times," Robert finally said, his voice breaking. "Every year, that past made it harder. Every anniversary, every birthday, every family gathering, I wanted to confess, but I was too much of a coward." Margaret sat across from him, her own emotions swinging between heartbreak and anger. "Tell me the truth, Robert, all of it. Who is Elena Martinez? Who are those children in the photographs?" Robert took a shaky breath and began to speak, his words coming slowly at first but then rushing out as if a dam had burst. He told Margaret that his real name was Roberto Martinez, and he had been born in a small village outside Guadalajara, Mexico. When he was 21, he had married Elena, his childhood sweetheart, and they had 2 children together, Carlos and Maria. Life in Mexico had been difficult, Robert explained. There were no good jobs in their village, and Roberto struggled to provide for his young family. Like many men in his situation, he decided to cross the border into the United States, planning to find work and send money home until he could bring his family to join him. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few years to build things, and when he finally made it to California, he was broke, scared, and desperate. He had no identification, no legal way to work, and no place to live. That's when he met someone who offered to help him create a new identity. "I became Robert Chen," he continued, his voice filled with shame. "I bought fake documents, learned to speak English better, and created a whole new history for myself. I told people my family had died because it was easier than explaining the truth. I planned to work for a few years, save money, and then bring Elena and the children to America. But everything got so complicated." Margaret listened in stunned silence as Robert explained how his new identity had trapped him. The longer he lived as Robert Chen, the harder it became to reveal the truth. He had gotten a good job at an accounting firm, found a nice apartment, and started building the kind of life he had always dreamed of. But he was also sending every extra dollar to Elena, supporting 2 households on 1 salary. A better life for everyone. But crossing the border illegally had been terrifying and dangerous. Roberto had paid smugglers most of his savvy. "Then I met you," Robert said, looking directly at Margaret for the first time since the conversation began. I fell in love with you completely, honestly, truly. But by then I was in too deep with the lies. I thought maybe I could gradually tell you the truth after we were married, but every day made it harder. Margaret felt her heart breaking as she realized the impossible situation Robert had created for himself. But what about Elena? What about your children? You just abandoned them? No, Robert said emphatically. I never abandoned them. I've been sending money every month for 50 years. Elena knows I'm alive and working in America. I told her I was trying to get legal status so I could bring them here safely. She's been waiting all this time, believing I would come back for them, or find a way to bring them to America. The weight of this revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Elena had been waiting for 50 years, raising her children alone, believing that her husband would eventually return or send for them. Meanwhile, Margaret had been living what she thought was a complete and honest marriage, never knowing she was sharing her husband with another family. The children, Margaret whispered. They grew up without their father. Robert nodded, tears streaming down his face. Carlos is 49 now. Maria is 47. They both have families of their own. I've missed everything. Their graduations, their weddings, the birth of their children. I know them only through letters and photographs that Elena sends me. Margaret tried to process the enormity of what Robert was telling her. For 50 years, he had been living two completely separate lives. Every business trip, every time he said he was working late, every carefully planned expense, it had all been part of an elaborate system to support both families without either one knowing about the other. How? Margaret asked. How did you manage to hide this for so long? Robert explained his careful system. The business trips were real, but some of them included detours to wire money to Mexico. He had a separate bank account under his original name that his employers didn't know about. He worked extra hours and took on freelance accounting jobs, telling Margaret the money was going into their savings when actually much of it was being sent to Elena. Every dollar I sent to them came from extra work, Robert insisted. I never took money away from you or our children. I worked twice as hard to support both families, but it was never enough. Elena needed more than I could send, and you deserved more than I could give while supporting two households. Margaret realized that Robert's careful budgeting and occasional financial stress now made sense. She had always admired his ability to stretch their money and provide for their family on an accountant's salary, never knowing he was performing a nearly impossible balancing act. Do they know about me? Margaret asked. Does Elena know you? Remarried? Robert shook his head. Elena thinks I'm still trying to get legal status to bring them to America. She doesn't know about you, about our children, about any of this life. She's been faithful to me for 50 years, waiting for me to keep my promise. The conversation was interrupted by Robert's sudden confusion returning. The stress of the confession seemed to trigger his dementia symptoms, and Margaret watched, helplessly, as the man who had just been speaking clearly began to look around the room with bewilderment, as if he couldn't remember where he was or what they had been discussing. But Margaret now knew the truth, and there was no going back. The weeks following Robert's confession were the hardest of Margaret's life. She felt like she was living in two different worlds, the familiar world of caring for her husband with dementia, and the shocking new reality where everything she had believed about their marriage was a lie. Some days, Robert would remember their conversation and beg for her forgiveness with tears in his eyes. Other days, his dementia would erase the memory completely, and he would ask her why she seemed so sad. Margaret struggled with anger, heartbreak, and confusion that threatened to overwhelm her. She found herself studying their old photo albums with new eyes, looking for signs she had missed. She remembered Robert's occasional sadness during holidays, which she had attributed to missing his deceased parents. Now she understood he was thinking about Elena and their children celebrating without him in Mexico. What hurt most was realizing that their entire financial history needed to be re-examined. Margaret spent hours going through old bank statements and tax records, slowly uncovering the careful system Robert had used to support two families. She found evidence of money transfers, extra jobs he had never mentioned, and income that had mysteriously disappeared over the years. The man she had trusted completely with their finances had been living a double life right under her nose. But as angry as Margaret felt, she couldn't ignore the fact that Robert was clearly suffering. His dementia was progressing rapidly, perhaps accelerated by the stress of finally revealing his secret. Dr. Peterson explained that major emotional trauma could sometimes worsen cognitive decline. Robert was forgetting more each day, struggling with basic tasks and becoming increasingly confused about time and place. During his clearer moments, Robert would talk about Elena and their children with such love and regret that Margaret's heart broke for all of them. He described Elena as a strong, patient woman who had raised their children alone, while believing her husband would eventually return. He talked about Carlos, who had become a teacher like Elena, and Maria, who had started a small business selling handmade crafts. These were real people whose lives had been shaped by Robert's choices, just as Margaret's life had been. One evening, about 6 weeks after the discovery, Robert had what would turn out to be one of his last truly lucid conversations. He took Margaret's hands and looked directly into her eyes with complete clarity. "I know I don't have much time left," he said quietly. "The doctors think I have maybe a few months before this disease takes me completely. Margaret, I need you to help me do something right before I die." Margaret listened as Robert explained his desperate wish to somehow bring his two families together before his death. He wanted Elena to know the truth about where he had been for 50 years, and he wanted Margaret to understand that his love for her had been genuine despite the lies. Most importantly, he wanted to apologize to everyone he had hurt, and try to provide some closure for the people who would be left behind. "Elena deserves to know that I didn't abandon our children by choice," Robert said. "She deserves to know that I thought about them every single day and that the money I sent wasn't charity, it was love. And you deserve to know that everything I felt for you was real, even though the foundation it was built on was a lie." Margaret wrestled with this request for several days. Part of her wanted nothing to do with Elena or the children Robert had abandoned. They were reminders of the deception that had poisoned her marriage. But her nursing background had taught her about the importance of closure and healing, and she could see how desperately Robert needed to make peace before his death. After many sleepless nights, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She would help Robert contact Elena, not for his sake, but because Elena deserved to know the truth about the man she had been waiting for. Margaret spent hours with Robert, helping him compose an email that explained everything: his illegal immigration, his false identity, his marriage to Margaret, and his deep regret for the choices he had made. The response from Elena came 3 days later. Margaret sat beside Robert as he struggled to read the email with his declining vision. Elena wrote in English, explaining that she had learned the language over the years, hoping it would help when Robert finally came home. She was heartbroken to learn about his other life, but she thanked Margaret for having the courage to contact her. Elena requested a video call, wanting to see Robert one last time and to meet the woman who had shared his life. Margaret agreed, knowing this might be Robert's final chance to find some peace. The call was scheduled for the following Sunday afternoon. When the video call connected, Margaret found herself looking at a woman who was remarkably similar to herself in many ways. Elena had aged gracefully, with silver hair and kind eyes that reflected both strength and sadness. Beside her sat 2 adults who were unmistakably Robert's children. They had his gentle eyes and quiet demeanor. The conversation was difficult and emotional. Robert, despite his declining condition, managed to express his love and regret to Elena and their children. He apologized for the 50 years of deception and explained that his choice to create a new identity had trapped him in a situation he never intended. Elena listened with tears in her eyes, occasionally asking questions that Robert struggled to answer clearly. What moved Margaret most was Elena's grace and forgiveness. Despite 5 decades of waiting and uncertainty, Elena told Robert that she understood why he had made his choices. She had suspected something was wrong when he stopped writing about bringing them to America, but she had chosen to believe in his promise rather than face the possibility that he might have moved on without them. Carlos and Maria spoke briefly with their father, expressing years of confusion and hurt, but also acknowledging the financial support that had helped them build their lives. Margaret realized that Robert's secret had affected 4 families: Elena's family, her own family, and the children from both marriages who had grown up not knowing about each other. After the call ended, Robert seemed more peaceful than Margaret had seen him in months. The burden of his secret was finally lifted even as his mind continued to deteriorate. He died 6 weeks later, holding Margaret's hand and whispering Elena's name along with hers. Following Robert's funeral, Margaret made a decision that shocked her own children. She used a portion of Robert's life insurance money to travel to Mexico and meet Elena in person. The 2 women who had loved the same man spent 3 days together, sharing stories and helping each other understand the full picture of Robert's complex life. Elena had never remarried, holding on to hope that Robert would return. Margaret realized that in some ways they had both been widows long before Robert's death. Elena had lost her husband 50 years ago, and Margaret had lost the man she thought she knew when she found the blue box. In an act of generosity that she couldn't fully explain, Margaret helped Elena's son Carlos pursue a graduate degree in education that Robert had always promised to fund. It felt like completing something Robert had started, and it gave Margaret a sense of purpose beyond her grief and anger. Margaret returned home with a complicated but peaceful understanding of her marriage. She had learned that love could coexist with deception, that good people could make terrible choices, and that forgiveness sometimes meant accepting that the people we love are capable of both great love and great harm. She chose to remember the Robert who had been her devoted husband, while acknowledging the Roberto who had been a conflicted man, trying to honor impossible promises to 2 families he genuinely loved. The blue box now sits in Margaret's bedroom closet, no longer hidden but not forgotten. Inside are the documents that revealed 50 years of secrets, along with letters from Elena and photos of the Mexican family Robert never stopped loving. Margaret has found peace in knowing the whole truth, even though it changed everything she thought she knew about her life.